Welcome to Hospice Explained. This podcast is intended as an educational aid and is only a resource to begin to understand the end-of-life season. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek advice from your physician or qualified members of your healthcare team with any questions regarding a medical condition.
Hello and welcome to Hospice Explained, episode number 115. I'm your host, Marie Betcher, RN. This is a replay of episode number 36 with Derek J. Flores, RN. Derek is also a guest on episode number 57. Derek has multiple books on Amazon and is a dedicated hospice nurse. Please enjoy this episode. Thank you. Derek is a registered nurse living and working in northern Colorado. He earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and an ADN from LCCC in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He has been an RN for more than 10 years, and his career is split between hospice and pediatric home health. His first book, 7 Keys to a Peaceful Passing, is a bestseller in its category on Amazon.com and was featured on the Doctors TV show in May 2020. Derek is the dad of 3 adult daughters and now the father-in-law of 2 wonderful son-in-laws. He spends his free time snowboarding and practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Welcome to Hospice Explained, Derek.
Thanks, Maria. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to your audience.
Thank you, Derek. So I've read Derek's book, 7 Keys to a Peaceful Passing, a hospice nurse's step-by-step guide to hospice. Derek, tell me a little bit more about the book.
Well, thanks for asking. So in 2018, I felt inspired to write a book for different reasons. But having been a hospice nurse for a few years, I wanted to share my experiences in the hope of people being able to navigate the hospice experience that they have, either as a patient or as a family member.
I really liked the book. I read it when I was a hospice nurse. Before I even considered doing podcasting, I read it to be a better registered nurse in hospice. I think you're right. There are specific things we need to tell our patients. And I like the fact that you talked about using the words pain crisis. That really tells a lot.
Oh, I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's really, you could call it the bat signal, you could call it 911, but when a hospice team member hears those words, pain crisis, it really get things moving in the right direction to get somebody out of pain and into a comfortable situation. So tried to give some tips throughout the book. I'm kind of a combination of being a practical person and being creative, but I did want to give some practical words and scenarios and tools that people could use to get what we call as hospice nurses a good outcome.
I agree. I highly recommend it to a patient's family or a loved one to read it, just to familiarize yourself with our terms so that you can kind of speak to the nurses. And service failure, I mean, honestly, that's another phrase that you could tell somebody that you just don't feel like the service is really what you expected, and it can really tell the staff, I need you to do something about this.
Right. Every organization, I think, can fall prey to some of the same pitfalls, whether it's hospice or a corporation. You get people together and they can do a great job or they could struggle. So being able to make your hospice team accountable if they need to. And I think it is a rare occasion where a service failure happens, but that's another phrase that will get somebody's attention if things aren't going right. And I think it's important as hospice nurses that we're honest with people to let them know that they are empowered to actually fire the hospice if they need to and find another hospice organization that can do a better job. It happens very rarely. But I think if people were to think that they're stuck in a situation that might not be working for whatever reason, then they really need to know that they can make a change if they need to.
Well, I agree. A service failure is actually a rare occurrence, but it does help a family member understand that they can reach out and ask for help. And it's a key word to kind of help them, guide them Derek, also in the book, it talks about one person is just not enough. I really agree with that. I had a recent episode where I talked about, I think two is the absolute minimum. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I think two's quite often a stretch. It can be done, like you said, but in the end, you're going to have two exhausted caregivers, even if the situation with the patient is not a serious one where we're managing a lot of symptoms and everything goes as planned. I've even seen large families fall prey to what we call caregiver fatigue or breakdown. And it's something as nurses we're always keeping an eye on. And it's actually one of those situations where I kind of go out on a limb sometime and put my foot down in a kind of a kind and even use humor sometimes to let people know, like, hey, we can't have everyone in the family up with the patient all night and expect that everybody's going to get through this over the next however long period of time. So I encourage people to take shifts if they're taking care of mom or dad and to really pace themselves out. I describe it as we don't really know if this is a sprint or a marathon, and we need to assume it's a marathon.
It's true. It's true. I had an uncle that went like 20 days without water, IV fluids, or anything. And that I remember reading in your book is also one of the rare occurrences. And that was like 14 years ago before I knew as much as I do now, but seriously, long. That was a marathon. And then you have family members that are going fast and furious. Tell me about the stages of dying. There's transitioning and active dying. What are your thoughts on both of those and caregiving and how you can help people learn when it's a marathon and when it's a sprint?
Oh, sure. That's a good question. So transitioning is really two different variables in play. One is the amount of food somebody's eating, how often they're eating, and how much they're eating, in play with how much they're sleeping. So, what we see in transitioning most often is someone eating less and less and sleeping more and more until they're sleeping all the time and they're not eating anything. And that's usually the point where somebody crosses over from transitioning to actively dying, which is a second phase. It is the length of time for someone in actively dying phase would be kind of their body weight and sometimes their height. It's kind of a function of how long the body can keep going.
Right, right. That makes sense. You mentioned humor. I really appreciate a little humor now and again, but it's not that easy sometimes to be a hospice nurse and throw in that humor.
Yeah, you can really take a chance doing that, but you have to read the room well and get to know the people you're talking with. And I think especially, I was telling a family member recently, I said, especially coming out of this COVID pandemic, I think people are hurting so badly for some sort of connection, even with their hospice nurses. And many of them have been taking care of an elderly parent for the last 2.5 or almost 3 years through the pandemic and being isolated through the whole experience. And they're just craving human interaction. And they also are craving acknowledgement and reinforcement that they've done a good job. That would be something I'd really want to share with your audience, especially if there's other hospice nurses listening, is that we have such a great opportunity as nurses to tell people the truth and that they've done a wonderful job in caring for their loved one. I don't think I've ever had something that I've said to so many people have such a big effect. It really doesn't have anything to do with me, but so often they're in the middle of this difficult situation for an extended time and they've never heard a voice say good job. And I just think it's such a powerful phrase that we can share, an affirmation for people.
100% agree. 100% agree. And I've done that myself. Just stop and say, you're doing a really good job. And that's, and then as nurses, we come in and try to help people do even better of a job on caring for that loved one.
You're right. You're right. Our experience, and we've seen different trends in how someone declines and say going into active phase of dying, where we look for changes in respirations, not only the pace of respirations, but are they breathing shallow? Are they taking big breaths and then stopping, and teaching the family to observe for apnea, which is when someone stops breathing for a period of time, and how that'll change and extend until that next breath just doesn't come and someone does pass.
Exactly. That makes sense.
Right.
Derek, have you ever run across a family that won't tell their loved one they're dying? Like, won't tell grandma she's got a tumor? As an admit nurse, I had that happen a few times. Got into the home and somebody writes a note, don't tell the patient they're dying. Derek, have you had a patient or have you dealt much with families that won't tell their loved one the truth that they're dying soon?
Oh yeah, I think it's actually pretty significant a percentage of families that do that. It happens enough that we're usually passing notes in between team members about that being an issue with a family or a patient. I'll go along with it up to a point. If the patient isn't cognitively intact, I can see the value to that because it can get somebody pretty upset that might have advanced stage dementia or Alzheimer's and not really understand the context of all that. Yeah, I think if somebody's not cognitively intact, I'll go along with it. But if somebody is lucid and they ask me straight up, who are you? I'm going to tell them the truth. And we all know from nursing school that we are advocates for our patients before we're anything else. And, that does even preclude the working relationships we have with their family members.
Right.
If I have a patient that asks me who I am, I say, I'm your hospice nurse. Or if they ask me what's going on, I'll be honest with them and let them know that they are approaching death because I think we owe that to our patients. I think there's usually something else going on in the family, some dynamic or something going on with the relationship, sometimes between adult children and their parents who are in hospice care for that. I think quite often we don't give elderly patients enough credit to realize that they can handle tough conversations. And
I 100% agree. I only ran into it a few times, but I found it very uncomfortable to not be as accurate as I could be.
I think there's a real benefit for patients to know what's happening to them. I think they can handle symptoms like pain a little easier if they know where they are perhaps in the process and know that their journey's close to ending. And I quite often tell my patients, you're almost there. You're almost there. If things have been difficult or we've been working to get a hold of a symptom, and I can see that that gives them some solace to know that this isn't going to go on forever.
Right. And I think you're right that telling someone the truth that this is finite and you're not going to do this for years can really be a benefit instead of, where a family thinks it's a benefit to hide the truth. I think the truth is the benefit.
Exactly.
So, Derek, there is a trend: death with dignity, medical aid in dying, physician assisted suicide. Do you have some thoughts regarding that subject?
I do. It's something that hits close to home. I actually testified in front of the Colorado legislature probably back in 2014, I think it was, because there was a bill up by the Hemlock Society. I know they've changed their name, but I think that's really how they best could be described. But wanting to pass that law in Colorado, and I spoke in opposition to it. I think maybe the reflex answer for a lot of us nurses would be to talk from a moral standpoint because we've all taken oaths to not do any harm to our patients. That's what we say the Nightingale Pledge when we graduate from school. But I think it actually wouldn't connect with as many people as we could reach with, instead of giving the message that it's really not necessary. I don't want to give people the impression that there aren't any difficult situations that we deal with and there aren't any difficult deaths, but the vast majority of them are not. Doctors and nurses working together are experts at getting a hold of symptoms like pain or shortness of breath or nausea and vomiting, all those things that we worry about as nurses. But this trend, we're really headed towards euthanasia. This is just a pit stop, I think, right now with what we call in Colorado medical aid in dying. And I think it's been a cleaned up version of what we described it back in physician aid in suicide. A doctor writing a prescription, usually for a barbiturate that's going to help a person take their life. And as a hospice nurse, I just know that I can help, and my fellow nurses and CNAs and chaplains and social workers all working together can help these people have a peaceful passing, and I just don't think it's necessary.
That makes sense. I had Dr. John Mulder on, and he talked about that also. And he was a palliative care doctor and hospice doctor, and his statement, his job is to relieve the burden of suffering. I took that to heart, as that is such a perfect way of is saying his job is to make this so it is
Mhm.
not suffering, but yet we all will suffer some.
Yeah.
It's a hard subject.
Yeah, I think the topic of physician-aided and suicide it's difficult because I think a reflex quite often is, we don't want our loved ones to suffer. And I totally don't want my patients to suffer. I want a family member of mine who's dying to suffer. And the truth of the matter is that in hospice, if we see somebody's uncomfortable, we can quickly work to get them in a much better spot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are those tough situations and tough diseases. The disease that really, I think, propelled this topic into law is Lou Gehrig's disease.
That's what I was thinking, ALS.
Yeah, ALS. I had a friend many years ago. He was in his 30s, and I got to see that disease up close and personal. He died in his middle 30s, I think, a good friend named Larry. And, that wasn't easy to see. But I guess what I'd want to share with your audience is that not even so much specifically about ALS or anything else. I've seen every disease that you probably have, every death process that's out there we've seen. But not only is the dying process a natural occurrence, that it's written into our hearts and our souls, and we can move on with our lives. The family can move on with their lives also by going through a natural grieving process and observing a natural death. And one of the arguments I feel strongly about against physician-aided suicide is that it interrupts the natural grieving process and the natural dying process for people other than the patient. They're seeing someone commit suicide right in front of them, or they see it immediately after. And we just aren't wired as creatures, whether you believe in God or not. It's not a normal way that a human being is meant to die. And I think that everybody deserves to have what so many of your guests have talked about. I listened to the podcast with Nurse Pepper, and gosh, I thought I had a line on, people's hearts and emotions, but gosh, that guy, he's got me beat 10 ways to Sunday. He's really sounds like a great nurse, but there's something that really beautiful that can happen out of the dying process, where people reminiscing and telling stories and laughing and crying right after, their mother died or their grandmother died. It's really a beautiful thing, and it's part of being human. And I would invite anyone that's listening to your broadcast today who might be thinking of taking this option as provided by the state that you live in. It's not in every state, but we're heading towards too many states having this. Is please consider a natural way of dying, and reach out to your hospice and ask them specific questions about, well, how do you deal with someone who's in pain or shortness of breath, or do we need to get them, what medications might we have available, because they can answer all those questions for you. And I feel strongly that your heart might be moved to make a different decision.
I think that's a great way to say that. I really appreciate hearing it that way, Derek. I can truly agree with several family members. We just had probably some of my most enjoyable visits was in the days before and after they passed, and with
Mm-hmm.
them, just really enjoyed chatting with them. And I think you chat with intention.
Mm-hmm.
This might be the last time I get to hear Dad's story that he told me 70 times and I wasn't listening.
Right.
But now it's time I really want to remember. And the funny thing is, you think about this. So my dad's been gone 14 years, and there's some stories I just wish I could sit and listen to him tell. I didn't record them. So, nowadays we have so many better
Mm-hmm.
opportunities to record. So,
Mm-hmm.
things to
Yeah.
think about: recording your loved one, record some of those memories.
Mm.
As we have all these quick little videos on our phone, but just enjoy that time. Just really stop and enjoy those visits with family and loved ones. It doesn't have to be family, but loved ones.
Right. I agree. Most definitely. And there are some hospices that have different programs or tools or
Yes.
nice little projects that the social workers will help you create a memory with your loved one.
Yes. In pediatrics, we had several different things we used: handprints, hair locks, and they'd make necklaces or thumbprint necklaces. Derek, do you have a good story for my listeners?
I think I do. There's so many people that I've worked with over the years. I'm sure it's into maybe a few thousand, at least different patients I've met over time. But there's one lady that I think she probably qualifies as my favorite patient. I'll change her name just for her privacy and her family's privacy. I'll call her Susan. So she was an elderly lady who lived in northern Colorado, and I was her nurse case manager. And the first time I met her, I was actually taking her case from another nurse. And my first impression of her is she's very demanding, like overly demanding. And I could tell just by her home that she's very wealthy. And I just knew she was used to getting what she wanted. And I wasn't sure it would be the best situation for me, but I just said to myself, well, just be patient. And sure enough, we ended up being very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
I was single at the time, and even tease each other, and she would tell me that she was my dating coach. Yeah, I've had a few of them over the years. Actually had one lady recently who earned that title also, but
Oh, that's funny.
I felt like it was a fun thing that she would ask me about a date that I went on here or there. So,
Well, absolutely. She needs to hear about something of what's going outside of her, because many patients are just stuck in their homes.
oh, sure.
What about, would you say that patients, their studies have been done, but don't you think patients really do live longer when they get comfortable in their own hospice? And that it's not about dying faster, it's being comfortable however long they have.
They do. There's a lot of attention that hospice patients get from the team members. They're discussed as a team, a larger team actually, on a regular basis, where a medical director who's a doctor will ask questions of the team and vice versa, just to come up with the best regimen of medications and cares for the patient. And quite often they do respond to those adjustments that we make to care that they'd been receiving in the past. So there's some real practical reasons for going into hospice and hoping and expecting to have a longer life. We're not sure how much longer it could be, but it's definitely a possibility.
Well, and it's not just about being longer, it's the quality is improved
Yeah.
because we've managed the symptoms, we've managed pain, shortness of breath, anxiety, etc.
Most definitely, yeah. A lot of times, people are in all sorts of difficult situations. They may have not had many visitors at home who could give feedback to family or get extra attention, but with hospice coming in, usually 3 visits a week, and that's a combination of CNA coming in twice a week and nurse coming in at least once. We can observe changes and address symptoms that are popping up.
Absolutely. That sounds exactly what I talk about. Derek, I understand you've also got another book out. It's called Letters to a Hospice Nurse, and it also has a companion workbook called My Letter. You want to tell us some more about your book?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about this project. Yeah, it's on Amazon, and the companion guide, which is called My Letter, is also available. As a hospice nurse, maybe you would agree is that quite often our patients aren't able to speak to us and tell us about the amazing lives that they've lived. It may have been a life full of success and accolades, and maybe participating in a great campaign like World War II, but our patients aren't able to do that quite often, and we're left with seeing pictures next to their bed of them as young people, and then they started to have families and extended families now. So I wanted to hear some of those stories, I guess kind of from a selfish way, because I hadn't heard all their stories. So I reached out to surviving family members to share the stories of people that they loved. And like I said, some of the stories were amazing about things that people had accomplished in life, but I actually found so much beauty in hearing the stories of people who had difficult circumstances, who maybe struggled with mental illness, or someone who was young at the time they got sick and trying to get the most out of a very, what we would consider, brief life. So I think there's beauty in everyone's story, and Letters to a Hospice Nurse really celebrates the lives that all of us live. And I just think it's so important. And I think that the reason it's important is that when we have the chance to review our lives, whether it's the patient themselves or the patient and the family celebrating the life that's been lived during the hospice process, I think that the chances for what we call a good outcome increases so much because people are in a much better place emotionally and spiritually if they've had a chance to tell their story or hear the story of someone that they love.
Absolutely. That sounds wonderful. I'm sure I will get a copy.
Also wanted to add that there's a companion journal that goes along with the book. It's called My Letter, and this is a great opportunity for all of us to share our stories. You could even start writing your letter right now as a healthy person, something that you could leave as a keepsake for a family member, children, or someone else that you want to share your story with. And it's also a great tool for patients that are in hospice and their families and being able to work through their memories and maybe even some difficult things, maybe something so as important as someone saying, I'm sorry. I know that I hurt you. This was what was happening with me. I take responsibility for it. And I want to leave you with forgiveness and love.
Oh, that's beautiful. One of my early episodes was something not quite exactly like that, but someone who was a very organized person and she helped formulate her memorial service, what she wanted. She had tags on all of her furniture, pictures, what each of the kids would get. This would have been something that she would have dove right into and had probably a letter to each of her children. And it's perfect because some people really need that. And I think that companion workbook will be perfect. There's a lot of folks that may want to write a letter and
Mhm.
maybe they're not even brave enough to do a phone call or to save some of that in person, but they can at least tell, like you say, ask for forgiveness, tell the person where they were at in life and why.
Yeah, I think that offers opportunity for healing for everybody involved by those letters. And I really created that notebook or I called My Letter for bereavement teams in hospices, people like chaplains, social workers, and there's grief counselors and people that really specialize in helping families who are struggling with grieving. And my hope is that they'll hear this message and go and get the book and My Letter for their clients, their patients.
That is perfect because one of the things that people don't realize is when a person signs up for hospice, their loved ones get bereavement. Now, usually, correct me, Derek, if I'm wrong, but I believe, like, for instance, a spouse or one of the children, but they can really help work through grieving.
They can. I think it's the most underutilized asset of hospices, bereavement services. I think it's the rare exception, unfortunately, that people, when they get that phone call from the bereavement team, usually a week or two after somebody passes, and they check in on everybody to see how the family's doing. Quite often, the response is kind of an automatic response, and that's like, oh, we're okay.
Bereavement is, I believe, very underutilized. And I confess, as a nurse, as a I confess that I didn't even ever use bereavement services. I've had loved ones on hospice and got those phone calls. And I'm like, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I'm good. I'm good. I want them to call somebody else to take care of somebody else. But I think I could have used it and I didn't. Even so, I'm guilty of that, not using the bereavement service.
Hmm.
Right. And
Right.
to my understanding, the bereavement lasts 13 months. So they can facilitate groups.
Hmm. I agree with you. It's definitely the most underutilized tool out there that hospice offers to families. And I'm not sure if it's our pride that we all have or what it is, but and there are people that are able to get through the process themselves of grieving and they do okay. But so many people do suffer, and I'm sure you'd agree. We invite them to take advantage of that. Maybe it's only a few sessions talking with somebody really can help you.
Well, thank you, Derek Flores, RN, for being on Hospice Explained today. Derek, do you have any closing thoughts for my audience?
I guess I just want to leave people on a positive note that I believe in hospice. I think it's a wonderful thing for helping people through a difficult time. I just want to share with your listeners a message of hope. We've talked about some things that aren't easy in our discussion, but I am very much a fan, a proponent of hospice and the work that our teams do. I think it's very special work. I feel grateful for doing it. And I hope that if you have a hospice experience, or maybe you're listening to this broadcast after having gone through that it was a positive thing. And yeah, we're all here for you, no matter where you are listening to the program tonight. And I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Derek, so much for joining me on Hospice Explained. Thank you for listening to Hospice Explained podcast. If this podcast has blessed you or a loved one, please help me grow this podcast by 1, giving me a 5-star review, 2, leave me a written review, and 3, share the podcast with anyone who needs to hear it. Thank you.